Welcome to the Mindset Game podcast. I'm Vered Kogan, and I'm delighted to introduce you to Patricia Carl. Patty is a speaker, coach, and founder and CEO of Highland Performance Solutions, a woman-owned organizational consulting firm. As a visionary leader, Patty is inspired by human-centered motivation and behavior in the workplace, and its profound effect on individual fulfillment and performance. Patty and her team help leaders create thriving, dynamic, engaging cultures where people feel valued and motivated to do their best work. Her thought leadership has been featured in publications such as Forbes, which is how I met Patty because we're both Forbes contributors. And she has also been featured in the Harvard Business Review, ATD, and Entrepreneur Magazine. She is passionate about working with leaders, teams, and organizations to unlock potential and drive organizational performance by leveraging their most important asset, their people. So thank you so much, Patty, for being here with us today. I am so delighted to have this conversation.
Thank you for having me. I'm excited about it.
So how about we get started by kind of exploring a lot of the client experiences that you've had, because you see this firsthand. What are you noticing as some recent trends with regards to the people side of things, attracting, retaining, engaging talent these days?
Yeah, it's been a really interesting talent market for sure. I think in the 20 plus years I've been in human resources in my prior lives, I haven't seen anything like this, quite like this before. So, of course we've had just massive change that leaders have had to adapt to. But what we've seen is that employee-employer contract has shifted. It's different now. What people want and are demanding from work is quite a departure from what people had expected back in 2019. And my corporate clients are trying to figure out how to deal with it. Right. So this isn't a temporary state anymore. I think there's something like maybe only 6% of people want to work on site full time. And that's compared to in 2019, upwards of 60% of people were working on site fully. So that's a real shift and in a really short period of time. And so clients are trying to figure out, what do we do with our real estate footprint? How do we create connection? What stance do we take on hybrid versus remote versus on-site, so that we can continue to drive the kind of culture that we want in the organization?
So how has that contract changes specifically? So you've brought up some trends, but what specifically are you seeing as the biggest problems, and what does that mean for us potentially moving forward?
Yeah, the way it's changed is that the employees are much more in the driver's seat than they were a few years ago, and there are always pendulum swings in the talent market. But this one's a bit different. And there's also sort of a set of expectations that employees are setting with their employers around work-life balance. Some people have talked about quiet quitting. And that's really just a term for, I'm not going above and beyond for this job unless I'm perceiving a particular value to me to do so. And I'm going to protect the boundaries that I need to set in order to have a fulsome life. And I think that shift for employers is a difficult one, because that has implications across their organizations, everything from setting policy, right, to real estate footprint, to leadership. How do you lead people who have sort of a different set of expectations, and things are now on the table for negotiation? And how do you keep people engaged when they have these sort of expectations that perhaps they don't want to be on site fully, they are working from home or doing a hybrid arrangement? How do you keep people connected to each other and to the mission and the work of the organization?
Such big, important questions. And this is a very real problem or opportunity, right? Because it's both sides of the coin. Because longer term, I sense it's a very good thing for people to be more connected to other aspects of their life, right? Because it makes them a more fulfilled individual, which then translates into a more fulfilled employee, more engaged employee, and more connection, and so on. So I'm curious about kind of the generational perspective to this, with Gen Z's kind of now entering, and what does that have to do with this?
Yeah, we have really an unprecedented mix of generations in the workplace. So we have, up to 5 generations working together simultaneously, which is, when you think about the differences in values and value systems that the different generations have, and the different needs that they have in terms of their career development and their season of life, right? That those are vastly different. And I think that millennials sort of started the trend, and a lot of millennials are now in leadership positions, right? Because they're hitting that age. And Gen Z is right behind them in pushing the boundaries in terms of what work should look like. And that is a culture clash in some ways with those who are Gen X. I'm Gen X and older, because we grew up and came up through the ranks, paying our dues, working long hours, doing whatever it took to advance and to get the job done. And that is something that the millennials and Gen Zs are putting limits around. And that is ultimately, right, that's not necessarily a bad thing, to have boundaries and to have work-life balance. I imagine that some of the millennials and Gen Z folks saw their parents working really long hours. I know my 2 adult sons certainly saw that and probably say no thanks to all of that work. They want to have purposeful, meaningful work, and they expect their employers to also match their values and what the diversity expectations they have, the sustainability expectations they have. And so if you think about all of those different asks and demands on leaders and organizations, that's a lot to answer. And so it has all of these implications that organizations are grappling with, that can be really difficult to navigate when you have such divergence among your employees, and then you overlay that with that shifting employee-employer contract.
And so what does a leader do when, in a system perspective like this, where there are potentially 5 different generations with 5 different sets of values, motivations, and work patterns? How does a leader manage all of those potentially conflicting perspectives?
It's challenging, but I think that the answer or the antidote to that is what I call personalized leadership. We think about If you go on Facebook, all of your ads are customized to whatever you were searching for the night before online. Our medicine is now very tailored to our genetics and our makeup, and very targeted. Our news feeds are very personalized, right? And so leadership should follow suit, because one size fits one, really, when you think about it. Everyone has different social, emotional, development, career, financial needs. And as a leader, it's probably more work, but in order to help engage and retain your team members, you have to be able to drill down on what it is that they need and customize the experience for them. We're used to in organizations, and being in HR, I've seen it firsthand, and probably drove some of it firsthand, which is to sort of peanut butter spread policy and management approaches, because there's a focus on being fair and being equitable, but that doesn't always mean delivering the same kinds of delivering on the same kinds of needs for each of your employees. And so being able to, it's a very humanistic kind of leadership to say, like, I see you, I see what you need, and I'm going to do whatever I can to create the right environment where you can work at your best and also have a fulsome life.
So what you're bringing up here is really relevant and really important. And what I mean by that is having a leader really, you said, kind of delve into, first listen to, of course, what is important to the individuals on his or her team, because we can't know until we ask and truly listen. And once we get those values, what's highest on the values of our team members, personal values, career values, then we can do some of that alignment process. But we first need to know the truth of how they're perceiving work and their place in the work world and so on. I'm curious about how the leader's own personal preferences come into play, right? Because if we play, for example, with the thinker versus feeler, right? So in the Myers-Briggs personality preference, right? Because you brought up the whole context of fairness, right? So is fairness more of the feeler, which is everybody should be treated as a unique individual, or is it the more objective kind of thinker perspective, right? Where fairness is what's fair for everybody. And what we're needing here, I suspect, is some blending, right? To manage those two polarities, because neither one can work on its own, right? We know that they work together. So what are your perceptions around how a leader can manage his or her own preferences and needs to be able to fulfill that role, to really listen and be present with people?
It's a great question. And by the way, I'm a thinker on the Myers-Briggs, but I have to lean into being a feeler as a leader often, because I have people on my team who need that kind of attending to sort of their emotional landscape in a way that perhaps I don't need, or it isn't top of my list. It's interesting because I don't know if you've ever gone through an interview in a corporation, but a common question is, tell me about your leadership style. And my answer to that is, it depends, right? Because this shouldn't be a leader-centered, sort of approach, right? You can't center it around the way you like to lead. You have to center it around the people that you're serving, because from a leadership perspective, I'm a big believer in servant leadership, and and like wolves, like leading from the back. And so if you subscribe to that, then you are very other focused and not self-focused when you are utilizing a personalized leadership approach, right? And it doesn't mean that you don't also have to be fair. Of course, we have standards, we have performance metrics that people have to meet, and you have to hold people accountable. And so there's my thinker. And at the same time, people have very different starting points. So my master's is in social work, and I practiced as a therapist for a period of time. And one of the mottos, if you will, for social work is to start where the client is. And I firmly believe that applies to employees. It applies to customers. You have to start where they are and then lead toward the outcome that you're trying to achieve.
I wholeheartedly agree with you. And we know that as the basis for rapport. If I can't respectfully see your side of the world, if you will, your model of the world, your perspective, then there might be some protective parts of you that might need to defend and protect, and you might not even really lean into what I have to say anyway. So it is very important, we know, to have that rapport, which means to be curious, ideally compassionately curious about somebody else's perspective, and to really listen, really be present with them. And oftentimes what I see in my work and in my conversations with leaders is that when they do that, so first they get themselves prepared for those conversations, right, by doing their own work, building their own resilience capacity, being coherent, that they can be present with the other individual. And when the other individual or individuals get to express in a safe way, where they don't feel like they're judged, usually the conflict tends to soften and they tend to lean in toward what the leader proposes for them to do, and they can co-create some solution together. But it really does start with the leader themselves, because if they're not doing their own work, it's virtually impossible to truly be present, curious, non-judgmental, if you will, around somebody else's perspective. Because the other person will feel it at the non-conscious level, and they won't truly listen. Yeah.
Absolutely. I love what you said about curiosity, because I think that leading with curiosity is something we don't necessarily build a muscle around. So a lot of times when people are ascending in their careers, I mean, there's certainly a learning. You have to be able to learn and fail forward and all of that, but you get rewarded for problem solving, right? So you solve problems and you continue to ascend. When you're in a leadership role, you actually have to allow your employees to solve the problems, and you have to become more curious and empowering, even if you've seen that movie before and you could name that tune in 3 seconds, but you shouldn't, right? Because you're not allowing them to feel empowered. You're not allowing them to develop, and they don't necessarily feel trusted, right? And they don't trust in themselves to be able to solve the problems if you're always solving it for them.
Yeah. And that curiosity requires us to go inward. Because if I've got some judgments going in because of all the times that I've seen that story play out, right? Yeah. Then I can't truly physiologically be in a kind of balanced state to really listen. I'm going to block that out. I'm not going to be able to see what is right in front of me. And I might be blocking some solutions that could actually be the very solutions that we need. And so I love what you're saying, and being able to focus as a leader on what is the result that we want, and to kind of detach or soften from the how, the specific steps, to allow people the agency, the sense of control to co-create the path that is highest and best for everyone. And when we do that, then I think we have that, first of all, that sense of connection between the leader and his or her team members, because the person feels validated and accepted and heard, acknowledged, seen. And it also allows for the greater engagement, because what we know, and I imagine you know this also from your therapeutic background, is that when people feel like they have choice, that equals empowerment, and that equals engagement, because they're not in threat or danger. They are choosing to move forward. And it's such a key part. And that requires, from the leader's perspective, curiosity. Yeah. So how do we do this?
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right, by the way, on, and what you're describing in many ways is emotional intelligence, right? Where I've written a fair amount on emotional intelligence and the importance of that in leadership. In fact, it's sort of the predictor of good leadership, which is being able to have self-awareness, being able to have self-management, which is what you're talking about, doing the work. You have to know what your own stuff is that you're bringing to the table, being really aware of that and being able to manage it. And then really tuning in to what the needs are of your team, spoken and unspoken, and creating that sense of psychological safety. And that can, I think one thing that I see leaders struggle with is, how do you create psychological safety and also hold people accountable? Because you are always judging their performance. And that's a fair question. The way that I think about it is, psychological safety is having a predictable, consistent leader for whom there is no sort of nefarious guesswork around what nefarious things might be underfoot, because that's where a lot of anxiety comes in for people, is not knowing exactly where they stand and not understanding the expectations, and possibly getting a boss who, if they don't know which boss is going to show up that day. And all of those things create a lack of sort of stability for employees. Brene Brown says, and I firmly believe this, that clear is kind. And if you can be clear with people and transparent, even if you have to take the worst possible action you can take, like terminating someone's employment, if you've been clear and you've been kind and you've been transparent, that will still go well. You can still exit people with grace and dignity, and they will not be surprised. And that's critical.
I believe that being clear is being kind, and I believe that is the very essence of trust, right? That consistently showing up in a trustworthy way allows people to trust us, to trust the process, to lean in the midst of uncertainty, because there is that core that I know my leader's got my back, and he or she truly care about me, the human, and that they will be clear and kind with me no matter what. And so what are some ways that we can manage this when there are multiple people in our team, maybe multiple generations or just different perspectives, values, needs, wants? how can we be clear with expectations when everybody has different needs? And, for them to feel satisfied, different expectations need to be met. How do we manage that?
So the expectations are the expectations, right? I mean, we have organizations to run, we have business outcomes to achieve. That's just a fact. And so you set the expectations. It's kind of like the best teacher or coach you ever had, little league or whatever sport you played, where they held you to a really high standard, higher than you would have held yourself. And they believed that you could get there. And then they started where you were and they supported you in getting there. And they did it with kindness and compassion and still held you accountable. And that's the way that I think leaders can create an environment where the team performs at its highest level as individuals and as a collective. But you are applying, and that's because you are applying specific sort of interventions, if you will, for each different team member in order to achieve the goal. The goal doesn't change. The goal's the goal. But how I approach you and how I get you there and the environment I might need to construct for you to be most successful can be very different.
Thank you. And I love that you said that, because in my mind, actually, when I was thinking expectations, I was thinking the employees' expectations being different maybe than their neighbors. So I agree with you. And it's so cool that you brought that up, because yes, the expectations are the expectations, but that individual approach of how do we get to fulfilling on that end point, if you will, that expectation is different based on the employees' expectations of what they believe that they need and want in order to perform at their best. And so when we have different expectations by our team members, so let's say a Gen Z says, well, I want my work to fit around my life, and so I want to work this number of hours, or to work from here, from there, whatever it might be. And then you've got somebody else on the team that's saying, well, that I want something different, and maybe they need to work together. So how do we manage that dynamic as a leader?
Yeah. And it can be more work, by the way, for the leader. I'm not saying this is more efficient leadership, but it's more effective leadership. And so I think there always have to be, constraints that you put around how much you can do for any individual employee. If someone said, for example, if they were client facing and they wanted to work from midnight to 7 a.m. and that's when no clients were available, that's not workable, right? So it has to fit with, however, if they wanted to apply for a different role in the company and maybe in the warehouse, great. You can work 12 to 7, but there are with every role, there are particular constraints. And so if you think about, how can this person meet the objectives that are set around this role, right? And also balance that with what they need, and let them know, listen, you might say, for example, I don't care where and when you work, as long as you meet the business needs. And that means being available for your clients, available for your colleagues. And so if I have to lean in and be more specific than that, I can be, but I do tend to want to treat people like adults and to say, like, if you can figure out, because people want autonomy. And so if you can figure out how to get your job done and it works for you, great. Now, if you show me that you're struggling with that, then we might have to put in more constraints. I might have to be more specific about the expectations. And as long as you're transparent about that and you have those conversations and you're checking in often, then you can keep things on the rails. One thing that leaders don't do enough of, and I'm still always surprised by this, is spending time with their team members. I talk to leaders sometimes who no news is good news, and so they only check in when there's something wrong. Leaders really have to check in with people once a week, minimally. They must spend at least 30 minutes with each direct report every single week. And they need to ask them, what's working? What are you struggling with? And what support do you need? That they probably have more questions than that, but those are really important questions, because then you have an opportunity to course correct along the way. If you don't ever meet with them and you don't pay attention, you could get to the end of the year and find out goals weren't met, right? And if you're able to work with them constantly to make little adjustments and fine tune what they're doing, then that helps them grow. It helps you keep tabs on the work. And it also helps your employee feel connected.
Yeah, it's like putting money in the trust bank. Yes, building trust. Yes. Because if there is some polarity, if you will, right, like leaders' expectation versus employees' expectation, then it is that and, right? Me and you, how do we find a way to make that work? And if we can't in a clear way, then this is not the right fit, right? And so when we can be with the and, it's not either or, with that and, then we get to co-create something together, and to be able to really bring to life the essence that each person brings to the job, their natural strengths, the natural joy that they bring into the work. And so it's so interesting when you were saying earlier, and I'm a fellow Gen Xer, right? Work, right? My parents all about the hard work. And what we know now in terms of the research is that the more creative solutions happen when people are in a more synchronized, coherent state. And so we need to make sure that we're adhering to the mental health, to the overall holistic well-being of our team members, so that they can create maybe an even better solution that does not require as much work, but then still gets our organization the results that we're looking for. What else are you seeing in your work with clients around best practice to help attract, retain, engage their talent?
I think they're starting to, hear what people are saying, right? What the market is telling them, which is people want flexibility, and they're willing to take less money, less perks, whatever it is, in order to have flexibility. And so the companies that can get, and organizations that can get on board with that already have a leg up in the talent market, for sure. I think I know that and I don't remember the numbers exactly, but there was a study that recently came out from LinkedIn that showed that applications for hybrid and remote jobs far outstripped those that were on site. And so if you can provide what people are asking for, you already are attracting and retaining talent that you want, and you have an edge over the competition. I mean, it's a real competitive advantage. But also, it's not just enough to get people in the door and hope to hang on to them, because you need to engage people. And engagement, for people who don't use those kinds of words every day, are really measuring, if you look at the Gallup model, they're really measuring discretionary effort, which is what's the degree to which you go above and beyond the minimal requirements of your job, and intent to stay. So there is a retention piece there. And you want a set of engaged employees because they are going to knock it out of the park for you, versus the people who are clocking in and clocking out, phoning it in. Some people are calling it quiet quitting. You want people who are fully engaged because that's going to give you the performance that you want from the individuals and from the team. And so that engagement piece is people feel engaged with their leader. Leaders are major difference makers in engagement. If you think about organizations, especially big ones, they have all these different microcultures, right, within the organization. And you could have two employees who sit on two different teams, and their employee experience could be vastly different because of the leader. Does the leader create that environment? And so organizations need to invest in their leaders to teach them how to do these things, how to really customize an experience and create a microculture within their department that works for people, and to be able to spend time. One of the most important things is leader currency, and using that currency to spend time. Everybody wants more time with their leader. Unless the leader is not a great leader, everybody wants more time and more visibility with their leader. Everyone does. And so that is one of the biggest gifts that you can give them is, and you said this earlier, being present, really seeing them, making sure they know they belong, because that's a basic human need, and having them feel connected. And for some leaders, that comes very naturally. It's just sort of their default. For other leaders, it requires a lot more development so that they understand how to do that. And it requires things like assessments to help them become more self-aware. It requires coaching. It requires all those things so that they can show up in a way that is going to serve their employees so that they can be most successful.
So let's say a leader has done that work, the self-awareness, the self-management, gotten those tools, how to create that individualized leadership approach. And they have that trust and rapport, that level of engagement at the individual level, meaning them and the individual. But let's say now as a system, as a team, if there's more than one direct report, that there is a conflict between the team members. What can the leader do in that sense to help create more coherence from a social perspective?
Mm-hmm. The first thing is that the leader has to be, again, clear about the expectations of the team. The worst thing that you can have in a team is backbiting, or people feeling like they're an outcast. Those things happen in teams. Sometimes it can be a lot like the middle school lunch table. And so the leader has to be very clear that that's not tolerated. Full stop. If you have an issue, you first go talk with your team member and be transparent and clear and kind and try to work it out. And if you can't work it out, then the two of you should come see the leader and talk through it so that you can sort of rumble with each other, as Brene Brown says, and get to a place where it feels like a win-win. Everybody can sign up for it, or at least they can disagree and commit. And the leader it's the leader's job. And there are times on teams when it's an intractable problem because an individual is not behaving in the way that the leader has set an expectation, and they continue to behave in that way. And when that happens, as I've advised leaders for years, decades now, you can't, that's not sustainable. That person must leave, because it is infecting and affecting the entire team and the culture of your team. And so no matter, no matter how well they might be performing against their objectives, they still have to go. You change the people or you change the people. And I have leaders who have said to me, this person's really great at their job, and then they proceed to tell me all the sort of toxic behaviors that they're bringing. And my response to that is, then they're not doing their job, because jobs have both behavioral and technical aspects, and they are failing on the behavior side. And so you have to be clear. And if they are not able to change it, then they must go, no matter how great they are at their technical job, because what's happening is that you are degrading the performance of the team.
Thank you. And it goes back to safety, right? Because if they're not doing that, then other people, might not feel safe in the sense because the leader doesn't have their back and so on. And so you spoke of the importance of having some consistent, regular time and open communication, safe communication between leader and direct report. How important is it from a culture team perspective, a micro culture perspective, for the leader to create time for all of the people that need to work together and communicate together to have some face time, if you will? How important is that?
Very important. Just having activities around teaming is really important. And those can be more formal in the case of staff meetings. And those are important. You should be having every leader should have regular staff meetings in addition to the one-on-ones. Again, this is not efficient leadership. This is effective leadership. And so it takes time. And they call it leadership for a reason. And then there's also informal, like you have to be able to bring people together in more informal ways. Wherever possible. It's a little harder with remote and geographically dispersed teams, but you can still do it. And you can foster a culture where you encourage people to connect informally with one another, because that's critical. People need to feel like they have connections, not just with you as the leader, but also with their team members. Because if you think about it, most of us spend the majority of our time at work. That is our primary community. And so building that sense of connection and community is really crucial.
And I imagine, this is not my area of expertise, so I'd like your feedback on this, but I imagine that one way to do this is to create some meaningful, unified goals. So let's say even if it's a volunteer, philanthropic kind of thing, together to build, to create, to help someone, so that they have a joint intention. First of all, it gives more meaning to work because it connects work to other aspects of their life, like helping the world, helping the environment, nature, whatever it might be. But also it allows individuals on the team to connect on things that are neutral, where there's a common intention and not necessarily bringing the day-to-day conflict into those more personal conversations. What do you see in that, if anything?
I think that's a wonderful point, because a lot of roles within organizations are set up for conflict. There's inherent conflict in them. There's always sales and operations. Sales overcommits, operations then has to deliver, right? There's always this tug between departments and different roles within organizations for good reason, because you want the healthy tension within organizations. And so I think you have to, first of all, make sure people understand we will have conflict. I fully expect it. And it's how we handle it that matters. It's not that we have it, it's how we handle it. So I think that's important. And what you bring up is an opportunity for people to step outside of those roles that may feel like they're in conflict and find other common ground, which is really important. And also appealing to something higher than themselves or bigger than themselves. And I think everybody wants to feel part of something bigger than themselves, and they want to be able to contribute. And I believe fully that, maybe with some exceptions, everybody shows up at work wanting to bring their best self and wanting to do a good job. I don't take the pessimistic view that people will do as little as possible. I do believe that people want to show up and do meaningful work, and that they want to have meaningful connection. And so if you can tap into that in both formal and informal ways, then that helps the team gel, and it gives you some, as you said, deposits. I believe in the deposits and withdrawals, right? It allows the team members to give each other deposits so that it takes them through those conflictual times when they are making withdrawals.
Thank you. So this has been such a wonderful conversation, such an important conversation. So thank you so much. And how can people leverage all the awesome experience that you and your team have?
Thank you so much for your time. I've really enjoyed this. If folks want to reach out to us, we're at highlandperformancesolutions.com. And you'll see at least some of our team. We're growing all the time, but you'll see some of the things that we offer, as well as the vast experience that we have in trying to solve all things workforce challenge, all leadership and people and culture challenges, which are, as we say in HR, it is all about the people.
Yes, it is. It is. And it always starts from ourselves. And so I so appreciate that you and your team have that perspective as well. And so thank you again, Patty, for your wonderful, generous time and insight and resources that you've shared with all of us today.
Thanks, Farron. It was a delight.